Let's start right at the beginning in 95. Who first contacted you about this arms drop?
Well, the person who first contacted me in the very first place was a German businessman that I knew through my normal business dealings. He was a supplier of aircraft spares, for light aircraft like Cessnas and things like this. And he telephoned me one day and said that a Danish colleague of his was having difficulty putting a deal together, and he understood that I might be able to help him and asked if he could send my fax address, as it was then. Of course, we didn't have email then. Onto this Danish businessman. And I said, yes, that was fine. And as a result of that, I was asked to give a quote for the supply of some AK-47 rifles and ammunition.
And that was it. It was just AK-47s, was it?
At that stage, it was only AK-47s. I think it was, I can't remember the exact figure then. I think it was 1,500 or something like that. Okay. Pretty routine stuff in the defence trade. Even in India, many of the security forces buy AK-47s. There's a good market in them. It's bread and butter stuff in the arms trade. So I didn't think anything of that at all. I compiled a quote. And I don't know if you know anything about the defence trade, but it's like any other international business in machinery. It's very difficult to give a quote unless you know roughly where it's going. And that's purely for reasons of freight. Heavy equipment costs a lot of money to move by air or by sea. And so I said that I needed an approximate location where this was to be delivered, just as a guideline for the price. And the approximate location I was given was Kolkata.
Okay.
So I compiled that quote and sent it off.
And then you went and and then they confirmed the quote, right? Because I'm now trying to jump a little bit.
Yes, they sent me a fax saying they were happy with the prices and the costs, and would I fly to Copenhagen and finalise the deal, sign the contract, essentially. A little bit unusual to do that, but these were people I'd never met before, and usually you trade with people either that you know or who have been recommended by somebody you knew. I wasn't too worried because they'd come to me through this German businessman, but still I was quite pleased to be able to go and see the people. And No, not at all. At this stage, I had no reason whatsoever to believe there was anything wrong with this deal at all. It all sounded completely normal. There was no message the arms were destined for India. The only reason that I thought Calcutta had been given to me was to give me an approximate location so I could calculate freight costs. And it wouldn't have made any difference if it was Kolkata, Bangkok, anywhere like that. The freight would have been approximately the same. Can I just explain something to you there, which might help to understand? In the arms trade, and indeed in any trade like that, we all broker deals with different people. No one person can fulfill every detail of any contract.
Right. So you went to Copenhagen after this?
Yes, I went to Copenhagen after this. I was met at the airport by the German businessman, and he took me to a house in quite a smart suburb of Copenhagen. Please don't ask me to try and pronounce that. It's absolutely impossible for me to pronounce that Scandinavian word. But it was a nice place by the waterside, where I was met by the two Danish businessmen. One was called Peter Haystrup, the other was called Brian Tuna. And we went through the details of the contract. I'd drawn up a standard contract, and in that contract was a thing called a non-circumvention clause, which meant that once we signed the contract, they could tell me who was the real end user of the arms, and I was contractually bound not to go behind their back to that user and say, buy from me direct, it would be cheaper. And I assumed I'd have a delivery address other than Calcutta after that. Anyway, we signed the contracts and they went through it and they said, well, look, there's just one problem here. You've given us a quote to deliver these armaments to Kolkata. And I must just explain to you that in the defense industry, you never ever, when you're dealing with legal deals, which is what I was involved with, you don't deliver to people. You always deliver to the customs warehouse at the port concerned. So I would expect, if a deal was with India, I would expect, for example, to consign the goods to the bonded warehouse with the customs at Calcutta Port. And Calcutta Port can be either by the Hooghly there, if it's by ship, or it can be at the airport.
So here, what did they say?
Well, this was the peculiar thing. This is what alerted me that there was something wrong, because they said to me, you've quoted for delivery to Calcutta Port, but actually we want the guns delivered inland. How are you going to get them from Calcutta Port to where we want them inland? And of course, immediately I understood that this was not a legal deal. No legitimate trader would ever ask that question. It's impossible. Business is only ever done to customs warehouse.
So did you raise that with them?
Yes, I did. But you do have to remember my position. I was all by myself in a city that I'd never visited before. I don't speak any Danish. It's a difficult language. My concern was to get away back to England as fast as possible. So all I wanted to do really was buy a bit of time until I could get back to London and speak to the Ministry of Defence, who we worked with in those days. So I said to them, look, I've given you a quote on the basis of a legitimate deal. If you want something else, it's a completely different subject. I would have to give you a different quote altogether. And so then they said, well, just a minute. I also said, I have to know exactly where you want these arms delivered. So these two men spoke a little bit with each other in Danish. And all the way along, I'd been conscious that there was another person present in the house. And I presumed it was somebody's wife staying out of the way whilst we talked a bit of business. This was a waterfront house with a decking on three sides, so you could sit out on the water, you see. Anyway, they went outside and I could hear voices, and they came back in with the guy that I now know, or knew as Kim Davey. I now know his real name was Niels Christian Nielsen. Didn't know that at the time. They introduced him as the man in charge of the group who wanted the gun. And he produced a large-scale map of West Bengal, and he stuck his finger on a place called Purulia, and he said, it's just near there that I want these delivered. And he said to me at the time, there's a disused airfield near Dhanbad, and he pointed to it on the map. It must have been an inch to a mile, I would think, that the scale of that map. And so I said, well, on that basis, I'll give you another quote. I didn't know if I would or not, but I was saying that because I wanted to leave. I certainly wasn't going to tell them they were naughty boys because I was a long way from home and nobody knew where I was. That would have been just stupid.
So that's when you went back?
Yeah, I was taken to the airport. I flew back to Manchester as it happened, caught the train back to my office, and the next morning I telephoned the Ministry of Defence and told them exactly what happened. And then I followed that up with a fax to the same person, and that fax later became quite a controversial document.
And then what happened? Then they got back to you, or you got back to them?
No, the Ministry of Defence told me that I was to continue dealing with these people as normal. I was not under any circumstances to give them any clue that I'd reported this to the authorities, and they would come back to me with advice on exactly what to do quite soon. And that's exactly what I did.
Okay, so then what would be the next stage? The next stage is after you've completed all your negotiations. Did they add to the supply? I mean, did they ask for other weapons as well?
No. What they did, yes, well, yes and no. At the beginning, if I remember correctly, the first supply was for 1,500 rifles. So I made a quote on that basis. And I put together a quote of approximately what it would cost for delivery as they wanted it, and I sent that off. I got a fax back saying that that was acceptable to them, and they wanted to meet in Bangkok. to discuss the final details. And as it happened, I had to fly to Bangladesh anyway, and Bangkok's an easy hop on there. So I met them in Bangkok. And this is when I met Kim Davies' colleague from Hong Kong, Wai Hong Mak.
So all of them were there, all the 3+1, or how many people did you meet in Bangkok?
There was myself. Peter Haystrup flew out from Copenhagen to be there as well. Wai Hong Mak, Kim P. Davy, and there was another Indian guy called Randy. I never did find out what his actual name was, but traditionally dressed chap in kurta pajama and what have you, sandals.
But could you make out from which state he was?
No. Sadly, you have to remember I was a relatively small player in the defence field. India is big league. It was out of my depth. There's no way somebody of my level could supply to the Indian forces. So my knowledge of internal Indian politics of the states and the different languages was very, very small. That's changed now, but in those days, I didn't know anything about that at all.
So what was finalized? What was finalized in Bangkok?
In Bangkok, they decided they didn't want 1,500 rifles. They wanted 300 rifles, but that they wanted other things as well, like hand grenades, pistols, some rocket launchers, stuff like that. The usual terrorist package. That's what it is. You can't class it as anything else. I've heard it said that this is for self-defense. I'm on record as saying that I wouldn't regard that as a defensive package. That's an aggressive package of armaments. But the fundamental thing that they decided there was that they wanted to buy an aircraft of their own to deliver these goods. Previously, they would have rented an aircraft, you see, but this now changed. And where before they had suggested to make a landing at a disused mine strip near Dhanbad, they changed their minds this time. They wanted to drop the arms by parachute. The previous plan had been to land an aircraft at a disused minefield landing strip near Dhanbad, just over the border in Bihar. But at Bangkok, they decided they wanted to buy an aircraft of their own and that they would then use that to run freight around the subcontinent. And on this now, they wanted to drop these arms by parachute. I've forgotten the name, near that area, Anandanagar, quite close to Anandanagar.
And this Indian chap was sort of playing a big role in the conversation. Did he have a lot to say, or was he just sitting by?
Yes, he did have quite a lot to say, but he didn't speak English. Okay. And so every few sentences we would stop and Kim Davy would translate into Hindi for him and they'd have a conversation. Then we'd switch back to English and discuss some more. And so it continued like that.
And so then the logistics were decided at the Bangkok meeting, right?
That's right, yes. And immediately after I got back to the UK from Bangkok, I had another meeting with MI5 and Special Branch and gave them a complete update of this latest thing that we were now buying an aircraft. They then told me that they'd been in discussions with the Indian government, that the Indian government was fully aware of what was happening. Mm-hmm. I did not know who was the end user of the arms and ammunition. And again, you have to just forgive my ignorance. I knew nothing of politics in West Bengal or Bihar. The facts and the notes that I sent to MI5 showed that I had said that I understood that the group concerned wanted these arms and ammunition to attack a communist government of a state. Now, of course, anybody who knew anything at all about India would have immediately thought, well, that's the government of West Bengal. I was completely unaware of the nature of the government of West Bengal.
But you did know. But you did know that the arms were meant for a communist government.
To be used against a communist government, yes. And that was reported and that was passed on to India by MI5.